Okay, okay. So I'm going to do a talk about this book called Saving Monticello. It's a history of Thomas Jefferson's house, but it focuses on what happened after Jefferson died. And it's a long and interesting and little known story of historic preservation. There's a Jewish American history component to it. It's a story of Thomas Jefferson and architecture. And you know, historic preservation is at the center of this talk, and Virginia historic preservation in specifically. And I always like to say that, you know, I live in Virginia, and we Virginians have a special feeling for historic preservation. And the way I like to illustrate it is to ask the question, how many Virginians does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer is 3. 1 to change the bulb, and 2 to reminisce about how good the old one was. So this story of historic preservation begins on one of the most amazing days in American history, and that was the day that Thomas Jefferson died. And I think you guys probably know what day that was. July 4th, 1826, no less, the 50th anniversary of the republic of which Jefferson was so instrumental in founding. And, you know, he died at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon up on his farm, up on the mountain up there at Monticello. And then a couple of hours later at his farm in Massachusetts, John Adams died. Our second and third presidents died on the 50th anniversary of the republic that they formed. And, you know, when word got out, and word did get out, you know, this was, I think it was before Twitter and CNN, but I'm not sure, but word did get out. And, you know, people reacted apocalyptically. John Quincy Adams wrote in his diary, these 2 men dying on this day was divine intervention. And, you know, the other thing you should know about July 4th, 1826, is that when Thomas Jefferson died, he was over $107,000 in debt. $107,000 in debt in 1826. Well, $107,000, people ask me all the time, how much would that be in current dollars? Because that's an awful lot of money even today. And, you know, there's websites you can go to that you can place in figures, and they do estimates. Anyway, the best estimate is that the family faced at least $2 million in debt. And who was the family? So, well, let me just, before we do that, you know, did Jefferson know what he was doing? What happened with all that debt? And we'll get into that in a minute. But he knew he was going to pass on debts to his family. So in 1815, the year after the end of the, I almost said Spanish-American War, of the War of 1812, Jefferson sold his entire library to the Congress. You know, there was the British burned the library, treasured the White House, remember, after the Battle of Bladensburg. And Jefferson was in need of money, so he sold almost 7,000 books to the country for almost $24,000. And if you go to the Library of Congress, it became the foundation of the new library, but became the Library of Congress. And if you go to the Library of Congress today, they have the books that he sold, and you know, a lot of them were burned in a fire in the 1850s, and they've replaced nearly all of them. I got to see the room where they displayed it when I was doing the research for this book way back in 2000. It's definitely worth seeing if you go to the Library of Congress. There's a plaintive letter that he wrote to a friend when the last books were being taken off of Monticello. You know, here's a man who said, I cannot live without books. And of course, you know, book dealers knew that, and this was 1815. So between then and when he died in 1826, they came up there and sold him so many books. He had 3,000 more books when he died that the family had to get rid of to pay his debt. So who did inherit? You know, remember that Jefferson's wife, whose name was Martha, she had died, and his oldest daughter, Martha Randolph, lived up there at Monticello with him because she had a kind of a no-good husband with her 11 children. And she was the executor of his estate. She was a Randolph, she came from the Randolph family. She married a Randolph, and her son, Thomas Jefferson Randolph, Thomas Jefferson's favorite grandchild, inherited the $107,000 debt. They didn't know what to do. They were the Randolphs of Virginia, but they were land rich and cash poor. And very reluctantly, they decided first that they would sell off all of Jefferson's stuff, to use the technical term, his furniture and furnishings. And of course, what else did he own? Over 200 enslaved people. So they had an auction up on the mountain a year after he died in 1827. We don't know how much totally they got from the auction, but we do know that it wasn't enough to cover the debt. And here are some documents that I found about some of the stuff that was sold. And, it gives you a little chilling thing to see people listed there. One Negro boy, $355, 2 chairs, et cetera, et cetera. Here's another one. One Negro mama, a woman, Rachel, $85. Oh, and a feather bed, $17.50. They decided, family reluctantly decided that they would have to sell Monticello and the acreage around it, which was, Jefferson inherited over 5,000 acres from his father. Not all around Monticello, but it was well up there. And you know what? They didn't sell it. They weren't able to sell it for about 4 years. And when we think about it, it's sort of puzzling today because Monticello is an icon. It's listed as a World Heritage Site by UNESCO, and the only residence in the United States, North America, that's listed. And you know what World Heritage Site? We're talking about the Grand Canyon, the Taj Mahal, places like that. It's been on the back of, it was on the back of the $2 bill from 1912 until 1976, when they changed it to that scene of the Declaration of Independence. It's been on postage stamps. You have a nickel in your pocket, you have a picture of Monticello. This is the so-called nickel view of Monticello from the south entrance. It is just one gorgeous, you can't take a bad picture of Monticello. And I have a few of them here that kind of prove that. Where it is. People, I'm sure you all have been there, up in the Blue Ridge Mountain, right in the foothills of the Blue Ridge. In the spring and the fall, it's just spectacular. You're looking at the nickel view there again. Just happened to prove that you can't take a bad picture of Monticello, because I took this picture one morning. I was on a special tour facing east, just at 9:30 in the morning. It was just, that was amateur photographer myself. So, fish pond, another picture of the fish pond. So, I'm saying that Monticello is the third most well-known house in the United States, right? We all know what number 1 is, White House. And of course, you all know what number 2 is, Graceland, right? Elvis Presley's house. So I'm only half joking when I say that. But so this icon of American architecture, what President Theodore Roosevelt called Thomas Jefferson's essay in architecture. Why did it take the Randolphs 4 years to sell the place? Well, for one thing, Thomas Jefferson was a self-trained architect, and he had some interesting ideas about architecture. He was the first person to put a dome on Monticello itself was one of the first architecturally designed residences in the United States. And Jefferson put a dome on it, which, was unprecedented. He did not put a giant staircase. This is the parlor, the entrance hall, and, where you come in on the tour. And if you look, you don't see any giant staircase. He didn't believe in them. There are 2 small staircases that wind up upstairs. He also didn't really believe in bedrooms. The family's bedrooms are upstairs. They're nothing special. He himself didn't even want a bedroom. I think you probably know this. This is his bed chamber. He designed this bed in a little archway between his cabinet, which is like his office, and his dressing room here. So, plus he put the place up on a mountain. Think about it. If you've been to Monticello, it's a nice drive up that mountain, maybe a mile up. It's not a giant mountain, but can you imagine what it was like back then when when the roads weren't paved, and you had to bring water up there and supplies? And so most of the other houses of that type were built on flat surfaces, for transportation purposes. So for all that, this kind of quirky house was like a white elephant. The family, there was no MLS back then. It was never listed for sale. But if you read the letters, the prices, there's one of them says 40,000, 20,000. Anyway, it didn't sell and it didn't sell. And finally it did sell in 1831 to this man, James Turner Barclay. And he bought it from the Randolphs with 552 acres for $7,000. And I don't have time to talk too much about James Turner Barclay because our time is limited, but Barclay was an eccentric man. He was a pharmacist in Charlottesville. Back then you had to be an MD to be a pharmacist. So he had a medical degree from what is now the University of Pennsylvania. But he decided he moved his family up there and he decided he wanted to start a silkworm business up there. And there was something called the Grove. It was a grove, 8-acre grove of trees that Jefferson planted and Barclay all but destroyed it. The mulberry bushes that he put in, nothing worked up there for him. People kept coming up to see this place, bidden and unbidden, and Barclay decided he didn't want it anymore. So he put it on the market. He let it be known that he sold off acreage. It was down to 219 acres, and he sold it in 1834. And this is not a picture from 1834. This is from later, but the place was a wreck when he sold it. So here's kind of a comparison between what it looked like at its worst, because we're going to go into another period of decline later, which I'll explain, and what it's like today. So someone who was there wrote in a letter back home that all was in dilapidation and ruin. Well, how did Monticello get to be in dilapidation and ruin? Well, a lot of it had to do with Thomas Jefferson's financial condition. He came back to Monticello in 1809 after serving his 2 terms as president, but there was no presidential pension back then. And he had over $11,000 in debts going back to the Revolutionary War. And he thought that he could pay off those debts with his farming and business ventures. Well, think about Thomas Jefferson. Think about this man who was president, vice president, secretary of state, ambassador to France, governor of Virginia. He wrote the Virginia Declaration, he wrote the Bill of Rights and the religious freedom law in Virginia. He was an archaeologist, astronomist, architect, you name it, he did it. I mean, you remember that great quote from President Kennedy when he had all those Nobel laureates for dinner in the White House. I think that this is the most extraordinary collection of talent, human knowledge ever gathered together at the White House, with the possible exception of when Thomas Jefferson dined alone. Well, there was one area of life that Jefferson was not good at, and that was business. He just was not a good businessman for whatever reason. Everything, he thought that he could turn these debts pay off the debts with his farming and business ventures. But everything failed. When he had 5,000 acres, he had these other farms. When the crops were good, prices were bad. When prices were bad, crops were good. He bought Natural Bridge from the King of England, hoping to turn that into a tourist attraction. It didn't work. He just lost money. He owned 3 mills on the river down there. They just leaked money. He owed money to all the merchants in Charlotte. He had enslaved people doing most of the work, all the work probably, but he didn't pay them, but he did have to house them and clothe them and feed them. He owed money to everybody. He doted on his children and his grandchildren. He spent money like crazy. He bought wine by the boatload from France. And also visitors kept coming up there, bidden and unbidden, family, close friends, and they brought servants and enslaved people. And it wasn't uncommon for 20 or 30 people to be living up there for weeks, if not months at a time. In short, the term preventive maintenance wasn't in the lexicon, but that's what happened. The place he just couldn't afford to keep it up. And it didn't get any better under James Turner Barclay. So finally, Barclay sells Monticello in 1834 to a most unlikely buyer. And that is a man named Uriah Phillips Levy. Uriah P. Levy, who then was a lieutenant in the U.S. Navy. And he purchased Monticello and 219 acres from James Turner Barclay for $2,700. All was in dilapidation and ruin. Levy set about to repair, restore, and preserve Monticello, although the words preserve and restore were not in the language. And we have evidence from newspaper articles and letters at the time that he most certainly did that within a couple of years. So let's talk a little bit about this remarkable man, Uriah Levy, and then talk about what he did at Monticello and go over his Navy career. So he was born in 1892 in Philadelphia. This is a portrait of him that now stands in the U.S. Navy Academy Museum. You know, he was the first Jewish American to have a full Navy career. He served 50 years in the U.S. Navy. And when he retired, he died in service. When he died in service, he was a Commodore. So he was the highest ranking, first Jew to be first Jewish Commodore, which was the highest rank in the Navy at the time. This is a photograph of him late in life. He was born in 1892 in Philadelphia. He was a fifth-generation American. People seem to have a hard time processing that, but his great-great-grandfather came over here in 1733 with a group of 40 Jews who had escaped the Inquisition from Portugal, came to London, and the men, you know, they had to be crypto Jews, right? They couldn't practice their religion in Lisbon. This was his great-great-grandfather was a doctor, a medical doctor named Dr. Samuel Munez, N-U-N-E-Z. And his family story is that he was the physician to the King of Portugal, the court physician, and that they had to be they weren't able to practice their religion, that they were Inquisition spies living in the house, and they had made this miraculous escape by inviting an English sea captain over for dinner one day, and they said, "Would you like to see the ship after dinner?" And when he did, they sailed off to England. Which is a great story. I hope it's true, but it's come down. They got to London. A couple of years, they met up with other Jews, and they took off on this ship. This is the actual ship. No, it isn't. Wait, it's a model of the William and Sarah, which they arrived in Savannah, Georgia, in June of 1733. So this group of 40 Jews were among the founders of Savannah. I found this record from a 18th century early settlers of Georgia document. And if you can go down the left-hand column, you'll see N and then number 10. Can you see it? It says Munez, N-U-N-E-Z, Samuel M.D. And occupation, it says Jew. And underneath, you can see his family members who came with him. So those group of 40 Jews, by the way, Dr. Munez was the only medical doctor in the entire colony of Georgia for many years. And there was an epidemic, we think it was smallpox, and he helped stem the epidemic. And he was cited by Governor Oglethorpe of Georgia. And that document that he cited is in the museum at the synagogue. Did something here, okay. Mikveh Israel. Those, if anybody been to Savannah and they've been to downtown, they must have seen Mikveh Israel. It's the third oldest Jewish congregation in the nation, started by those 40 Jews. There's a picture of it. This isn't the old building, but this is their beautiful temple downtown on one of those beautiful squares in downtown Savannah. This is the inside of the sanctuary. It's just a gorgeous place. And a couple of years ago, they invited me down there. I was scholar in residence. The residence lasted a weekend, but it was my pleasure to do a talk on this book for them after services on Saturday morning. One of Uriah Levy's great-grandmother and grandfather moved to New York, the Machados, and he was the Hazan of Shirith Israel, which is the oldest Jewish congregation in the nation. This is their fourth building from they founded in 1654. This is their fourth building in New York from 1860. This is the current building, which is also a marvelous place. In 1897, Beaux-Arts building on Central Park West. I was lucky enough to do a talk there when the book came out. It's just an amazing experience. This is a sanctuary at Shearith, Israel. So the Levies have ties to the oldest Jewish congregation, Shearith, Israel, to Mikveh Israel in Savannah, and we'll see in a minute Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia, because Uriah Levy's maternal grandfather, we talk about him because he was important in Uriah Levy's life, Jonas Phillips, came over here from Germany before the Revolutionary War. He was a merchant. He moved to Philadelphia, and he became, he joined the Philadelphia militia unit, and he fought in the revolution against the Brits. Uriah Levy supposedly was his favorite grandchild, and he brought him up to be a patriotic American. Supposedly, Uriah's two heroes growing up were George Washington and John Paul Jones. And they were members of Mikveh Israel, the second oldest congregation in Center City, Philadelphia. This is their second building. No pictures of the first one. We'll talk about Uriah Levy's life in the Navy. So the family story is that he was 10 years old. He ran away from home to be a cabin boy in a shipwreck, but he made sure that he was home by 13 for his bar mitzvah. It's just a great story, and we're hoping it's true. So I'm just like you to know that. But here's what we do know for sure: that at 19, he was part owner of a merchant ship. And in the following year, when he was 20 years old, he joined the U.S. Navy and began a 50-year career in the Navy. He was assistant sailing master of the Argus, which was the most successful American ship blockading the English Channel during the war. I think it captured 25 ships. When it went to capture the 26th, the ship was captured, the captain was killed, and the crew was held prisoner for the balance of the war, including Uriah Levy. He came home, and a hero of the War of 1812, and went on to this 50-year career in the U.S. Navy. And he was, can you imagine what it was like to be a Jew in the Navy during that time? You may know that Uriah Levy survived. Not only did he survive, but he thrived. He was a very strong-willed man and a very tough-minded and tough guy, because he was kicked out of the Navy 5 times. All of those court-martials, let me go back. He was court-martialed 5 times and kicked out of the Navy twice, reinstated by 2 different U.S. presidents. Kicked out because, somebody would call him a dirty Jew, and he'd punch him in the face, and he would be the one who would get in trouble. He also killed a man in a duel. A fellow sailor called him a damn Jew at a ball in Philadelphia. He challenged him to a duel, and Levy shot him to death. He was tried for that in civilian case and acquitted. So you did not mess with Uriah Levy. He was a tough-minded, tough man. There's a biography of him called, I'll think of the name of it in a minute, but the something or other Commodore, the pugnacious Commodore. So this pugnacious man his Navy history has been well rewarded. The first Jewish chapel at any Navy base at Norfolk was named after him. It's still there in this building. A destroyer escort was named after him in World War II, USS Uriah P. Levy. It even had a role in taking the surrender of the Japanese, not at Tokyo Bay, but in one of the islands. The Naval Academy never had a Jewish chapel until a couple of years ago, and it was built. And what's the name of it? The Commodore Uriah P. Levy Center and Chapel. And here's another picture of it. The architect who designed it put a dome on one of the entrance, on the entrance toward the river. This is right in the middle of the U.S. Naval Academy, in honor of Uriah Levy's saving of Monticello. And the chapel, the Jewish chapel, is kind of designed in the form of a ship to honor Levy's service. Yeah, there's also a statue of him outside Mikveh Israel, where the family worshipped in Philadelphia. There's another picture of it. It was dedicated in 2011, I think. That's the plaque. I helped write that plaque, by the way. I was honored to be asked to do so. I was at the dedication ceremony. It was a great affair. So the question is, why did this U.S. Navy lieutenant buy Monticello? And the answer is, we don't know 100% certain, but we have some pretty good educated guesses, because Levy, all of his Navy records, you know how the Navy is. They have a record every time he got on a ship and got off. But if he kept a journal, and no one has ever found it. His letters mention mostly business stuff, but in the few letters that we have, and in the historical evidence that we've uncovered, we strongly believe that Uriah Levy was an ardent admirer of Thomas Jefferson, and when he found out the place was for sale, that he purchased it. Why do we know this? Well, on his own, in 1833, when he was in Paris, France, he went up to the top French sculptor of the day, a man named David d'Angers, and he commissioned out of his own pocket this full-length statue of Thomas Jefferson. He had it shipped to the United States. This is a plaster model of it, painted black, which he donated to the city of New York. That's a current picture of the statue in City Council chamber in New York City. Uriah Levy lived in New York City, by the way, when he wasn't on a ship. He donated the statue itself to the people of the United States. Congress didn't quite know what to do with it, so they stuck it, or they put it outside the White House. So here's an 1848 lithograph. Can you see that statue in front of the White House? But we do have some photographs from the 1860s. And there it is. Now, it stayed out there until the 1880s, when it got tarnished. I love these old photographs, so pardon me for showing them off a little bit. I like this view. This is from behind the statue facing out onto Lafayette Square. But the statue, it was a bronze, so it got weathered pretty badly. So Congress took it back, put it in the basement of the Capitol building, and then it wasn't until much later that they dusted it off, cleaned it up, and they put it in Statuary Hall. Then it was moved to the Rotunda. Well, here's Statuary Hall, and here's the Rotunda. So if you come in the Rotunda, you see the two statues by that entrance. The one on the left is a Jefferson statue by d'Angers. And if you take a look at it, you'll see a plaque. It says, donated to the people of the United States by U.S. Navy Lieutenant Uriah Phillips Levy. It's the only privately donated statue in the Capitol. So Uriah Levy, by the way, made a small fortune when he was in the Navy. He invested in real estate in the early 1800s, in the 1820s, in a section of New York City that was a farming village. And he bought 11 rooming houses there, something like that. And then a few years later, people started moving in, artisans, to what they call Greenwich Village. And he made a small fortune in real estate, so he was able to buy Monticello. He bought the place in 1834 from James Turner Barclay. He didn't take possession until 1836 because there was a lawsuit about what conveyed. They agreed, and he took over. He brought his elderly mother to live there, and she is buried at Monticello, Rachel Phillips Levy. This is the grave of Rachel Levy. It's an older picture. It's been changed a little bit. You can see the vegetable garden, the 1,000-foot vegetable garden over to the east of the grave. That's Mulberry Row to the left. This is a current picture of Rachel Levy's grave. He was at sea by the time. That's why she was buried on the grounds, because they didn't know what to do, but they knew the Jewish tradition, so they put her in the ground right away. So Uriah Levy died in 1862 in service. By the way, he wanted to fight in the Civil War, but he was, getting up in years. So you know what position President Lincoln gave him? He was in charge of the Navy Court-Martial Board. They figured he probably knew a lot about it, having 5 court-martials. So, and this is his gravestone at Beth Olem Cemetery in Queens, New York. Just going back a tiny bit, because Uriah Levy was a Northerner, Monticello was seized by the Confederate government because it was owned by a Northerner. He hired a lawyer when they tried to get it, and after he died, they kept the lawsuit going, but they finally lost. And in 1864, the Confederate States of America took over Monticello. They had an auction, and they auctioned off the property and Uriah Levy's possessions, including enslaved people. And this was an article from the New York Times. You don't have to read it, but it just, it's sort of chilling to read how much people by name sold for. And we'll talk about Uriah Levy's brother Jonas in a minute, because he tried to get Monticello, but it was sold to this man, Ben Ficklin, who was a Confederate colonel. And he moved his family up there in November of 64, but then the war ended in March of 65, and they left. People ask me sometimes, did Monticello get damaged during the Civil War? Luckily, even though 60% of the war was fought in Virginia, there was no battles in Charlottesville. A little skirmishing here or there, nothing bad. However, it was a crossroads for Union and Confederate troops, and they came up there like other people did. And, they didn't do any damage, but they did cause some wear and tear. Now, just a little bit about Uriah Levy's will. He married late in life. He didn't have any children. And he left, well, we don't quite know exactly why he did this, but he left Monticello to the people of the United States to be used as an agricultural school for the orphans of Navy warrant officers. Think about that one for a minute. The orphans, we don't even know if there were any orphans of Navy warrant officers in 1862. Well, the family, now, even though he had no children, he had a wife and he had, 12 brothers and sisters. There were 64 other people named in the will. They challenged the will in court. And so the lawsuits, they were called partition lawsuits, and they went on for 17 years. They wound up in the Supreme Courts of both Virginia and New York. And in the meantime, while the family was fighting it out, the government, by the way, had said no. So the family was trying to figure out what to do about it. And the place went into ruin again. And this is the oldest known photo of Monticello, taken about 1870. And you can see with your own eyes, the windows are broken. You can't see the roof caving in. The grounds were in terrible condition. The terraces had rotted away. And just very quickly, the main reason that happened was that during those 17 years, Monticello was under the care of a caretaker who didn't take very good care of it. His name was Joel Wheeler. And I'll just tell you quickly 3 things that Joel Wheeler did that weren't in Monticello's best interest. Number 1, he housed cattle in the basement during the winter. Number 2, he stored and milled grain on those beautiful parquet floors in the parlor. And number 3, and worst of all, he allowed University of Virginia students to have parties there. So I don't have to explain that to any audience who lives around here. Those UVA students wrecked the place, so did other people. I mean, he also allowed others. So the point being that the place was in dilapidation and ruin. When the lawsuit was set, well, here's a picture of Thomas Jefferson's grave. There was this tradition that they called chipping. People would come and take chips out of the grave. They took chips out of the plaster inside the house. There was a tradition of signing your name in the dome room. There were 3,000 signatures scrawled in the ceiling of the dome room in the house. The lawsuits were settled in 1879 when Uriah Levy's nephew, this man, and his name was Jefferson Monroe Levy, was named after 2 presidents. His father was Jonas Levy, who I showed you before, Uriah Levy's brother. He was a lawyer and a 3-term member of Congress, and also a very successful real estate and stock speculator, also from New York City. And Jefferson Levy bought out the other heirs for $10,500, kicked out Joel Wheeler, brought in his own superintendent, and once again, a second member of the Levy family repaired, restored, and preserved Monticello. And we'll just talk about Jefferson Levy very briefly, because he was a very interesting man. I have some photos of him. This is him a little bit later in life. This is him on Capitol Hill when he was a member of Congress, 3 terms in the early 20th century. A picture of Jefferson Monroe Levy. By the way, his father, Jonas, also named one of his other sons Louis Napoleon Levy. He was an interesting man. So we have photographic evidence. These are family photos that descendants kindly let me have for the book. And you can see here, we're talking about 1905, something like that, that the windows are, everything is looking good. There's some more photos taken later. Here's the lithograph that shows the place in great condition, but these are photographs. And the thing that architectural historians or preservationists are so pleased with both of the levees is that they never did anything bad at Monticello. They never added on to it. They never took anything away. All Jefferson Levy did was he modernized the heating and the plumbing. And if you see those two lions statues, that's all he did. He put dormers on, but that was it. And there were 4 what they called Levy lions. There's another picture. See the lions? They're pretty hideous. They're not there anymore. I love that picture. There were 2 on the grounds coming up and 2 on the north entrance. And he put some statuary around. Now, Jefferson Levy was a very sociable man. He was a lifelong bachelor. He lived in New York City, but he also spent a significant amount of time at Monticello. His sister Amelia was his hostess there, and they were always having visitors there, members of Congress, ambassadors, the Bridge Club from Richmond, the DAR chapter from Charlottesville. He was a very social man. He had 2 presidents visit. Grover Cleveland came in 1888, and when he was in Charlottesville, and President Theodore Roosevelt came in 1902, and being Theodore Roosevelt, he decided he wanted to ride a horse up to the mountain when he was visiting in Charlottesville, and they accommodated him, and he came up. Okay, so what is that expression? No good deed goes unpunished. In 1911, a national movement grew up to take Monticello from Jefferson Levy and turn it into a government-run shrine to Thomas Jefferson. It was led by this woman on the right, Maud Littleton, known as Mrs. Littleton. And by the way, in the press, by the way, Jefferson Levy and Uriah Levy purchased more acreage. So Monticello was up to about 600 acres. Now, and Jefferson Levy, who bought the place with no furniture, said that he was going to try to reacquire all that furniture and furnishings that was sold back in 1827. He wasn't successful. He only got a few things, a rug, a lamp, a table here or there. But he did fill that whole place with antiques, period pieces, that he was going to convey all of that. Well, we'll get to that in a minute. But Mrs. Littleton, I'll go to the Mrs. Littleton story. I got a little ahead of myself here because I'm rushing a little bit, Sheldon, because I know I'm going over my time here. So let's talk about Mrs. Littleton and her campaign. Her husband was a man named Martin Wiley Littleton, a big lawyer and a member of Congress from New York, Long Island. And they were friends with Jefferson Levy. They were visiting Charlottesville in 1909, sorry. And they were visiting the university president, alderman, and Jefferson Levy was at Monticello, heard they were in town, invited him up for lunch, and later Mrs. Littleton said she was appalled by what she saw there. She said that Jefferson Levy was turning the place into a shrine to Uriah Levy. This should not stand. It should be open to the public. And she started a national campaign to take Monticello from Jefferson Levy. It made the newspapers. There was a bill introduced in Congress at her behest in the summer of 1912. There were hearings on Capitol Hill that were bombastic. Jefferson Levy, not a shy and retiring man, he once said, you know, I'll sell Monticello when the White House is for sale. He wanted to keep that place. So he argued it out. He hired a lawyer named Tom Duke, Judge Duke from Charlottesville, whose grandfather was Thomas Jefferson's lawyer. And Jefferson Levy and his lawyer battled it out with Mrs. Littleton and her forces for who would control this house. And these hearings were bombastic. They made headlines in all the newspapers. Some people called it the War of 1912. Well, the War of 1912 ended in December when the bill came up for a vote on Capitol Hill to condemn Monticello and turn it into a government-run house museum. It was defeated. It was defeated on what we would call property rights argument. The government had never taken a piece of property from a private person, much less trying to turn it into a shrine. So Jefferson Levy declared victory, but Mrs. Littleton did not give in. She had the bill reintroduced. There were more hearings in 1913, even into 1914. By the way, so remember that portrait that I showed you earlier? This is when it was hanging in Monticello. And indeed, there was this portrait in there, and there was a model of Uriah Levy's ships, but Jefferson Levy was by no means turning it into a shrine to his uncle. She had petitions signed by hundreds of thousands of people. She was a wealthy woman. She had time. She had motivation. She had the energy. Finally, in October of 1914, Jefferson Levy gave in. The guy who said he would never sell it said that, okay, supposedly because President Woodrow Wilson, got on the team, and he was a Democrat and Levy was a Democrat. But anyway, we think that he probably just needed the money. And so he said that he would sell the place for $500,000. And remember, he bought it for $10,000, but he'd owned it all these years. And he said that he had spent, more than $1 million, probably $1.5 million, running that place as a farm, repairing it, restoring it, preserving it. And so Congress had more hearings for the next 3 years, but they could never wrap their arms around that $500,000 figure. I just have to tell you very quickly that Mrs. Littleton's campaign to take Monticello from Jefferson Levy was tinged with anti-Semitism. Neither Mrs. Littleton nor her supporters ever came right out and said Jews shouldn't own this place, but in her literature, in her speeches, and in her followers, she had magazine articles written. They used, what do we call them now? Dog whistles. They used, they called the Levies aliens and outsiders, as if Jefferson Levy couldn't have been more inside. By this time he was a sixth-generation American. So, and there was also a horrible story that they made up that made the newspapers and magazines about how Uriah Levy supposedly purchased Monticello, that he was in a coach coming down to Charlottesville, and just happened to be sitting next to him was a man who told him he was going to buy Monticello and give it to the Randolphs. So in this story, Uriah Levy gets him drunk, and he buys Monticello out from under him. And worst of all, the dialogue that's made up, they have Uriah Levy speaking in this Shylocky Yiddish accent, for a man who was born in Philadelphia and was a U.S. Navy officer. So I'm sorry to say it wasn't a good thing, but it has to be mentioned. So when World War I broke out in 1917, Congress dropped the matter. Mrs. Littleton had stepped away when Levy said that he was going to, and then Levy announced in 1918 that he would sell the place. So, he announced it earlier, but he really stepped it up. He got a realtor named Hillary in Washington, D.C., who specialized in Virginia states. I found a few prospecting letters and advertisements that Hillary made up that he wanted to sell Monticello. It didn't sell until 1921, when the Thomas Jefferson Foundation was formed specifically to purchase Monticello. It was formed in New York. There were a few Virginians in the group, and they met. They were mostly lawyers and business tycoons, and they took out a mortgage and they purchased Monticello. And the first thing that they did after they bought it was they had an auction up there, and they auctioned off all of the stuff that Jefferson Levy had filled that house with. And Monticello today is filled with about a third, they have reacquired about a third of what you see inside the house. About a third they bought are period pieces, and there are some, current pieces of furniture and furnishings in there. Just a couple pictures of Monticello. I just wanted to end by reading to you about the day that that Jefferson Levy turned over sold the place in 1921. This was up in New York City. Sorry, did I say 1920? It was 1923. A man who was there said the cash and the bonds and mortgage were delivered to Levy, and Levy signed the deed conveying full title to the property and all belongings to the foundation. This was a very emotional scene, and he burst out crying. He said that he never dreamt that he would ever part with the property. And then 3 months later, on March 6, 1924, at his home on East 37th Street in New York City, Jefferson Levy died of heart disease 5 weeks short of his 72nd birthday. And let me just finish by telling you that Jefferson Levy, not a shy and retiring man, liked to compare himself to Thomas Jefferson. He was named after Jefferson. He was a tall man. He was like 6'3", like Jefferson was. He once gave a dinner at Monticello for a bunch of guests where all 7 courses were from Thomas Jefferson's recipe books. And every 4th of July, he made it a point to be at Monticello, and we would have an Independence Day party. He would invite people from Charlottesville up to the mountaintop. They would have a picnic. They would have fireworks. And he would end the evening by coming out on the lawn and reading the Declaration of Independence from Thomas Jefferson's music stand. And the last thing I'll say, and the last way that Jefferson Levy emulated Thomas Jefferson was that when Jefferson Levy died, he was over $2 million in debt. That's my story, so thank you very much. There's a 4th of July, okay. I do have a newsletter that I have that I've been doing it for, gosh, I don't know, 17, 18 years. I put one out every month. I find information about levies and Monticello. If you're interested, email me. It's myname@gmail.com or go to my website. So.